to be here with you all this morning, and I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we gather on this morning and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. As Chris was saying, our discussion today will focus around families and everyday life. How do families navigate change and adversity, and what are the implications for family policy? So to help us to unpack all of that, we have a wonderful panel of experts here this morning with us, and I'd like to introduce them to you. Firstly, we have Professor Tim Reddel, Director of Social Solutions Group, Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Queensland. Welcome, Tim. We have Andrew Whitecross, General Manager Policy at the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. Welcome, Andrew. And we have Derek McCormack, Director of Raising Children Network. And finally, but not least, we have Karen Field, Chief Executive Officer of Drummond St Services. So please welcome our panel. Firstly, I might just ask you all to just tell us a bit about yourselves and you know, the area of work that the field that you're in. So, Tim, would you like to go first?
Great, thanks, Karla, and it's great to be here again. Last time I was here, I was working for the Department of Social Services, leading work on strategic policy, research and evaluation. So it's great to come back in my new role 2.5 years with the Institute for Social Science Research, and it just got me reflecting a little bit on my sort of career from the non-government sector through government and in both Commonwealth and state, and now working at the University of Queensland around how do we bring together the different elements of the policy, research, practice system together to look at solutions, particularly the challenges that we've been talking about at the conference, and many and all of you involved in your everyday work and lives around the needs of children and families, and how do we bring the lived experience, the expertise of people into the policy development process, and as researchers, how do we help that, how do we facilitate that? And I think some of the challenges that we have, that we haven't been as good at that as we should be, and how we work with communities, how we work with families, how we engage with the policy system. So that's part of what I've been endeavouring to do, and really keen to share some of my thinking around that with my colleagues here today and all of you.
Thank you, Tim. And Andrew?
Yes, I've got about 30-year history of working in the Department of Social Services on various social policy things, but mainly income support and family payments. I've also more recently been working in the area of upholding the human rights of people with disability, and I'm currently working in the policy area of the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, looking at how we can best uphold the rights of people with disability in the context of receiving NDIS services, and ensure their safety and their effective participation in decision making about things that affect them. And I've previously also worked for 18 months as the acting director of the Institute of Family Studies.
Thanks, Karla. Morning, everyone. My background, I'm not a researcher. I come from a background of communication of science and knowledge translation. The last 20 or so years I've been based at the Parenting Research Centre, working on a number of projects and programs that are about translating evidence into use. All of them are around helping parents make decisions, basically, and it's a great topic for today, I think. And more recently, I've become the director of Raising Children Network. And Raising Children Network is, at its heart, it's a digital parenting support initiative. So we're looking at what's possible in digital space to do that job of helping with decision making. Great to be here.
Thank you. And Karen?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I too want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians. I am very privileged to be the CEO of Drummond St, and it's still a joy after 17 years getting to work each day. So that's something post-COVID, I think. One of the things that's really unusual about Drummond St, I think, is that we are one of the oldest welfare organisations. But we started in a pandemic But why that's fascinating is that it was because of a coronial inquiry into the death of an itinerant worker who was ramped in a horse-drawn cart, you can see the parallels, and could not make it into the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And deeply embedded within that was about the way in which we distribute resources, our frames around who is deserving, inequalities, and that particularly continues to frame our thinking around the systemic failures. And as we sit in Royal Commission after Royal Commission, knowing that our systems continue to fail the same groups of people, I think this pandemic has showed us that we have deeply embedded inequalities and policies that left a large group of people incredibly vulnerable to not only getting the disease but dying from it, losing your jobs, not being able to put food on the table. And we continue to see that. So this idea of family choices to me needs a much better context and nuance.
Thank you for that, Karen. So firstly, I wanted to ask, what do we know about the types of decisions families are having to make in their everyday lives? Tim?
Well, I think we have to understand that the interlinked nature of family life, that we often don't think. We think about family policy often in silos, but that doesn't reflect the everyday dimensions of family and the diversity of what we mean by family in terms of its many dimensions, and that thinking about people's individual perspectives, but also think about the life course, how families evolve over the life course, and the importance of what's often talked about as linked lives, where individual lives will influence and be influenced by others, and how we think about families in their context of their communities, in families in context of their work lives or their other aspects of their life, and thinking about how those needs change over the life course and are influenced by policies, by the economy, by where people live. And I think we often think about family, and I think family policy then often is framed in a very siloed approach, and we don't think about that multidimensional nature of families, and both in understanding. I think, just reflecting a little bit on the role as a researcher, I think there's a lot more discussion now about how we do more end user research, how we understand the lived experience of people, how we co-design policies and programs with people, with the people that are directly affected, with families, in their different places, in their different contexts. And I think that's really important. But I think we need to really get into what that actually means, how the methods for doing that, and how does that actually influence policy making? How does it influence research? How does it influence the programs and the services that we develop? I think we've got a long way to go to do that. I think there are many, many examples where that's happening, but it's not part of the system yet. I think there's a lot of work that's happening, but how do we bring that together? I think that's a really important challenge that we need to take up.
And you mentioned what is a family? I mean, can we define, what is a family actually? Because obviously it's changed what we, perceived traditionally as the family unit. That's vastly changed in modern times.
As I say, families are in their context, in their people in their particular relationships of support and love, and we have to respect that in its many forms. So I think it's difficult to sort of come up with a neat definition, because it is people's, the people that they're connected to within, and not necessarily within a home. It's across different communities, different contexts, different history. So I think respecting that notion of family as multiple meanings and definitions for the individuals and for the family.
Can I just ask that of you, Karen, what the definition of family?
Yes, it's interesting because I was just reminded yesterday that I went into a a family meeting in an acute mental health ward in relation to a person who was in there and their family. So the family meeting. And this was after 10 days of that system not recognising this person's family of choice. That there was no significant attachments that related to blood, but a group of people that provided those caring relationships for each other that often had very disconnection from family of origin. So I think one of the things I'm noticing a lot more is that people are trying to use terms that are far more inclusive but really don't understand context. So if you're a trans parent, or you know, the fact that you know, for sometimes on our housing estates we find a group of sole parent female-headed households that are a family, and the way in which they navigate the world around them and the experiences of that. So it's not just enough to use the language, it's really about understanding the significant and intimate attachments that people can form around, you know, caring and looking after each other.
Okay. Now, I might just go back to you, Andrew. What do we know about the types of decisions families are having to make in their everyday lives from your perspective?
Well, I think I want to pick up on this point about, you know, what is a family, and link it to sort of how people make decisions. It was often in social policy we developed a more sophisticated understanding of what families look like, but a lot of policy is not made by people who come out of that sort of space, and I think human beings love making generalisations. They love sort of, you know, talking about averages. So, you know, you'll get people talking about, well, what the average single parent looks like, or you'll get people coming up with cameos to describe things. You know, John and Mary, you know, have 2 kids aged 7 and 3, you know. And these generalisations and these, you know, examples are all infused with miles of unconscious bias. You know, John and Mary obviously Anglo-Celtic, you know, they're legally married, you know, the kids from their current relationship, they live together in their own home with a mortgage, you know. Now John works full-time, Mary maybe works part-time, those sorts of things, right? Their parents live elsewhere, they visit them once a month, you know. So when you saw in the pandemic, and, you know, you gave some, suddenly these blind spots play out in policy. So they had policies around, you know, they announced policies around restrictions on movement. And these policies assumed that people could live in the bubble of their own household as a self-contained thing. So, but then there are children who live in more than one household, and you know, often those arrangements are the result of quite complex negotiations between parents. There are adults who are in close and important intimate relationships but live in different households. There are people who are deeply culturally committed to relationships with their extended family who don't actually live with them. And so then families have to decide, well, how do we navigate a set of rules which haven't really been made with us in mind? And because their circumstances have been ignored, they don't have the tools necessarily to make good decisions. So they are at more risk, you know, health consequences, you know, maybe, you know, but because policymakers haven't done the hard work of understanding and engaging with that diversity, and maybe reacting to it once it's pointed out to them, but not necessarily in a very sophisticated way, families can be left to make decisions without the information that they really need to make the best decisions for them and the people around them that they care about, even though they're the ones who are in the best position to protect their loved ones. They're the ones who are in the best position to keep them safe.
Derek, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, staying with the definitional stuff, it's a natural tendency for all of us, because we're not as clever as we think we are, to drift towards what's the highest abstraction that I can still understand. So we say family, that's an abstract word, but I think I know what it is. And then the reality is much more complex and nuanced, and the reality of any family, not just some families, but any family is more complex than that word. I think what this conversation is helping explore is the idea that, yes, policy and the development of policy is subject to that tendency, of course. It looks at problem areas or issues of vulnerability and heads that way with its action. But what we're talking about here is how could the future be a little different, where it's listening to the complexity, where we're embracing the hairy nature of intersectionality in families. And, you know, as a step parent of a trans young man whose children live in 2 houses, depending on the day, we live that every week. And it's not just some families, it's a lot of families who are, in a sense, coming up with their own policy solutions within their own realities. But going back to this kind of basic question of what do we know about the decisions, with our work in listening over the 16 years to what parents are seeking online, we know that it's the everyday things. It's choosing a school. It's what kind of support can I access, disability or otherwise. What will I do about the behavior issue I'm seeing? Am I seeing a behavior issue? Is this a developmentally normal thing to see in my child? These are the common questions that we know are turning into decision points for parents. And I think our job as a sort of sector is to say, okay, how are you? Are you okay? What can we do to help? This has been a theme during the conference, the listening mode. And what would it look like if you had help with that? And I think at a policy level, I'm not a policy analyst, I think there's an ambition, I think, bubbling away that what would it look like in the future if at a structural level those questions were being asked more. It's fantastic to hear about co-design becoming more than a phrase. It's great to see so much at this conference where co-design and human-centered design is in action and going further than the buzzword. But I think we have a long way to go in terms of recognizing that complexity and doing that listening to voice and to those hairy realities that span many households. Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to say, I think one of the issues about definition is for policymakers, they need to measure what they're doing. So we want to count, we want to a definition is important in one way for policymakers to think about how do we put parameters around what our problem is, and how do we define it, how do we measure it, and I think that doesn't take account often of the complexity that Derek and others have been talking about here, and how do we sort of look at the policy system to address that. And I think also how do policy practitioners, service delivery people, researchers get a better toolkit for doing that. I think to move co-design, from being a buzzword into something that works on the ground, but also can feed into how we think about making how decisions are made at all levels.
And Karen, I just wanted to go to you. I mean, obviously we've been going through a global pandemic for the last 2 years. How has COVID impacted the decisions families are making?
Yeah, I mean, I think of Marmot, who's been telling us forever that, we can't just have proportional universalism. That in fact, if we're not doing something about addressing the kind of inequalities, this idea we continue to frame things in terms of family decision making as somehow a level playing field. And we just saw, whilst we all had an experience of COVID and our families had experience of COVID, we were certainly not in the same boat by any stretch of the imagination. And, the framing of continually of social problems or issues or public troubles in the vein of the failures of individual choice, without understanding the bandwidth that people actually have in order to make choices. And, you know, I think new frames, new ideas about intersectionality. So it's not just about culture, but gender and the way in which that is not only within an individual, but also differentiates within a family system. So I think of a lot of the incredible families that we work with who have escaped war-torn countries. They come to this country, the choice that they made to escape, what they went to give their kids a better life is almost dropped away once they arrive here, and their ability to navigate often structural systems that you know, are incredibly embedded in racism, unconscious and sometimes very, very conscious. And the areas in which the state and government and policy chooses to intervene in their areas of family, and another system they don't. So if you think, you know, I think someone said to me, and that they shall remain nameless, but how interesting it was then when we were presenting on the vulnerable, poor families and state intervention around the safety of children, but then we go to the family law court, and then it's a very different situation on who can access the family law court. It's a presumption of shared parenting, and so that frame is missing there. So we choose areas where we're going to intervene and not intervene, and often it's driven by class. You know, none of the families that we work with, you know, from multicultural communities that may be huge numbers of sole parent, female-headed households, often their kids are having to navigate the system because of their English proficiency. And so the power dynamics and gender, it's not just about race, but settlement and all those things as it plays out over generations. Without that nuance, how do we understand the way in which decisions are made when often the families we work with are just surviving and have been surviving and for many, many years, but have made incredible decisions along that way. And if we can't recognise those, we continue to just see people as making, you know, poor choices and a whole range of other things. And that's the frame that's got to stop.
I think it's a fantastic provocation to say, okay, if we understand the kinds of decisions that are being made day to day, and let's just assume we do, how are they being made, and in the context of how many factors and what are those factors? It starts to feel very, very complicated to talk about it, but we do know that there are many things that impact any decision. There's what's happening inside the family dynamic, there's what's happening in the environment around the family, there's the intersectionality of needs in the individuals across the family. And then there's the environmental factors, the structural things around the family that are helping or hindering in that one decision. So I guess the challenge on the table is to say, how can we get better at understanding how, not what the decision is, but how it gets made in many different scenarios. And that means embracing, again, going beyond co-design and voice, which is where we are now. We are saying yes, voice. We are saying yes, human-centered, structural change, going further into, okay, let's see what are the mechanisms and approaches that will help us unpack that, the how the decision is made. Then we can maybe ask better questions about how can we help in your decision making.
So how do these decisions that they're making, how does that impact on families in the long term? You know, what are they all contending with?
In the long term, I think it's too nuanced to say a general statement, but I think what's happening in our discourse now as we talk about families being strong and being able to make decisions, and we say there's things that make a family strong, whatever a family is. There's warmth and connection, and there's resilience, and there's these internal things, and then there's things around the family, environmental factors that help with the decision making. And if we're getting it right, we are supporting parents as they navigate parenting, and we're offering our services as sort of lighthouses in that navigation. So that's a good, I think, framing of what's happening. But what I think we're talking about here is beyond that framing and understanding, what can we do around the nuance? What can we do around the actual listening, which gives our supports more context? I think it's the context of the decision making that we still haven't really embraced.
I find it absolutely fascinating that, you know, in the climate area, we do environmental impact reports in relation to, you know, new pieces of policy or whatever it is, but we don't do inequality impact reports and assessments on a piece of family policy. And I think it's such a lost opportunity if we continue to use our Western frames as to what parenting looks like, and we come to families with just our context. And we judge everything that family and those relationships and the way in which they touch systems, in every system. You know, one of the big issues within the LGBTI community, particularly for trans people, is not what they find difficult is that if you are assessing for family violence, they don't recognise family violence as any different from the violence that they experience in every walk of their lives. If you're a trans person, the violence that is when you hit medical systems and a whole range of other things. So using a screening tool or asking a set of questions, you know, if you just ask queer people if they've experienced family violence, only about 15% will say yes. But if you describe a deep set of behaviours over their lifetime, it trebles in terms of the numbers of people. This is where we get these things wrong, when we don't kind of understand that, you know, violence and experiences systems over time eradicate a person's belief in not just having a relationship or experiencing intimate partner violence, but experience violence right across your life.
Andrew, you know, once we start to understand what, you know, the decisions that people are making or families are making, you know, what are the impacts to them in the long term?
Well, if we can understand them, I guess there are impacts on how we might go about, you know, the policy design process, and ultimately, hopefully, better outcomes for people. I remember a few years ago, many years ago now, the then government was concerned that there are a lot of families with young people, you know, preschool age people, and you know the statistics said, you know, they hadn't been near a doctor in years, you know, and so there were all these undetected health problems, and you know that was going to set them back when they got to school. Schools were seeing kids for the first time with hearing problems or whatever, and, you know, so wouldn't it be good if we could encourage all these people to get to a doctor and make sure their kids are okay? So the idea that was come up with was, well, let's withhold some of their FTB unless they go to the doctor. So, you know, they miss out on $700 if they don't take their kid to the doctor. So, you know, so we tell them all to go to the doctor. So, you know, lots of people do. And, you know, but then there's a group of people that, well, they still haven't gone to the doctor, you know, and we're withholding their $700 and, you know, what's going to happen? So we said, oh no, we'll send them another letter. So we send them another letter and, you know, they still haven't been. When do we phone them up and say, you know, you should go to the doctor? Doesn't matter what you do, all those kind of interventions, you still got 5% of people who aren't going to go to the doctor. Right? And guess what? They were the ones we were worried about in the first place, right? Not all the other ones. They're the ones we were actually worried about because they're the ones who are missing out. But we've got But really, we've only got two, a hammer and a screwdriver here to solve this problem, which is financially penalise them or send them a letter. And, so if we understand better what's influencing those decisions, if we understand better, what it is that is between them and something that we think is good for them. Maybe it's because they've got 10 other things which are much more important to their well-being than this going to the doctor. Or maybe they don't understand why they're going to the doctor, so what's the point? Or maybe it's going to be a huge problem to get to the doctor, and they've got other problems to solve.
Yeah. It'd be good if someone had asked them.
Yeah, well, exactly. So understanding better might mean we came up with a better approach to solving the problem of how do we ensure that young people starting school are healthy and ready to learn, which is what we were trying to achieve in the first place, rather than applying our own idea, which is based on our own middle class sense of how people will respond when the government asks them to do something.
And it's that notion of one size fits all, and often that's government's default. We'll set up a policy that's this big when the problem might be, as you say, that big, but also it's going to be different in different places for different people. So how do we get systems that can engage with that diversity, understand what's going, and then actually develop more local solutions that might respond to those differences and needs.
Well, exactly, and
That
then
involve the people themselves.
and for some of those solutions might be isolated to particular cultural groups, to particular regions. There may not everybody experiences engaging with our policy systems and our service systems the same way. For some people, these service systems, are profoundly disquieting and context in which they experience fresh discrimination, fresh, alienation, not context in which they feel affirmed and upheld and supported.
And I suppose just reflecting on work I did in my early days with the Commonwealth, I worked in Indigenous affairs, working in remote communities, and the government of the day came up with a remote service delivery national partnership agreement with the Commonwealth and the states to roll out to around 30 remote Indigenous communities. And that was great. There was going to be extra money, more. I mean, the response was very much every community had to have do service mapping and do X, Y, and Z. It was very much, as I often call it, policy by template, that you have to have a sort of similar approach. It was meant to be more local solutions, but and there was some great stuff done. But the problem was it became this sort of overview approach rather than getting into the nuance of the local community and understanding and understanding what was already there too, often forgetting that there were local leadership, local solutions being developed by the communities. How do you bring that to bear? And it's hard for governments because, as I say, governments want to measure and count and get a holistic view, whilst how you do that, but also respecting the diversity of community and different groups within communities.
Derek, why is it important for us to know all this information, and why does understanding how and why families make decisions matter?
Why is it important? Well, I think it goes back to that nice example there around, as you put it, for some, a service or a support or a system is something that they don't want to engage with. And that's a symptom that we've got it maybe wrong, that we didn't take the right approach, and another approach might have helped. And in terms of why it's important to gather that data, I think it's in the evidence why. We know that for many families, what they see in a service is something they need to protect themselves from, or something to at least maybe avoid. And for other families, it's something they want to engage with. I think when it comes to designing any support, and I'm involved in designing digital information supports of different kinds, but for any kind of support, I think the goal is to try and understand the question in the mind of the beneficiary. So what are we trying to help with here? And that's easier in some contexts than others. I think that when we look at the positives, we see the importance of working with community in place-based ways to create situations that feel natural entry points, and that's a recognition of context. So if we are creating, let's say, a local hub or some sort of new initiative which is about offering support that is place-based, then we are trying to allow families of all kinds to see themselves in the support. I see myself there. I see myself going there for that support. So I think in terms of why it's important to gather the data, I think it's to recognize the many factors that are impacting on the decision. Those factors, they come in so many flavors. But I liked your mention earlier of bandwidth. Let's not trick ourselves into thinking that if we understand the family factors and the environmental factors and the kinds of financial and the realities around a decision, let's not pretend that we understand the bandwidth in the parent at that moment, or the child in that moment, or in the family as a unit in that moment, the bandwidth to make a decision in the first place. Often we're forgetting that they may not even be thinking that there is a decision to make. So what is it in our structural supports or in our online articles, what is it we are doing to recognize the fact that they may not be actually wrestling with a decision, but simply have a curiosity or a mild concern at that point? What are we doing to invite them in?
I think we will go a long way if we move from the one size fits all, but also the enactment of that piece of policy is often to big mobs, and so the kind of nuance that we've lost innovation, we've lost investment in innovation for the newer things, the things that make a difference. And one of the things that I have great hope in is that it's not just co-design and hearing what people, all that nuance and all that difference in the experience of everyday life over generations, but build it in your workforces. What people say to me is, I want to come somewhere that doesn't just maybe have a lived experience, because lived experience of families, so I'm pretty sure we all, unless someone knows something that I didn't, all have a lived experience of a family, but it's only our lived experience. And I have learnt so much from thinking differently about, I will not run a program or do a new piece of work without it being co-production. So I have an affirmative action employment policy that says, not only will I co-design, but I will identify the talent pool, the different knowledge base, the privileging different knowledge, cultural knowledge, queer knowledge, all these bits, and employ people and braid that. Like our Kiwi cousins have been telling us forever, you need to braid and elevate different knowledge. And so I have one of the most diverse workforces. I think I have 30 queer staff of all different alphabet soup, and that's interesting in itself. And but also, the beauty of that is that I have an enormous African staff that came from the high-rise housing estates. There is incredible talent pool out there that can help you work out how your programs can get better and what makes people. And I love this. I just endlessly love government's ideas of the door. Like, what is it about? The no wrong door, the door, even when the extreme lockdown happened, it was horrendous. One of my incredible African program managers of my family support services, she tells the story of sitting in her bedroom and she was braiding her hair, and her child and her husband were in the lounge, and next minute she heard them screaming, And then her phone just started dinging and dinging and dinging. And the first phone she answered was one of her and our dear African women leaders saying, "The soldiers are here." Now, great piece of public health policy that was, which, by the way, we still haven't apologised for. But what those family needs, the intel we had in order to get those families what we needed, came from my staff, who were also locked up in those housing estates. So I think there is incredible opportunity if we build diverse workforces that privilege that knowledge, that we are open to listening, and it makes an enormous difference to people not just walking through the door but recognising the door.
Yeah, seeing themselves in that door, and maybe it's not a door because of...
No.
You know, there was one concept...
And it's orange.
And it's orange. The colour is no wrong. That's the colour. There's one notion that I picked up at this conference which I wanted to make sure I got to say today, and that was the notion of a cultural resource. And it has lots of definitions, but I've witnessed it at the conference being used in relation to good communication resources around policy. A really good, let's say, explainer around a policy for a family, that's a good cultural resource. Staff who are fitted to the context of their community, that's a cultural resource. And more traditionally, a cultural resource can be, some architecture, or it could be a piece of history through storytelling. I think conversations are a cultural resource, and if we can look to generate nuanced and complex conversations around different areas of need or different decision points for families, then I think that would be a great thing. You walk away from conferences and you always feel all jazzed up about ideas. This time, for me, it's cultural resources and thinking about what are the different forms of cultural resource that we don't have, that could help families in all those different scenarios. And just embracing the fact that there may be hundreds we haven't thought of yet.
Karla, one thing that occurs to me, coming back to one of the questions you asked me about, well, what would be different if we understood the kind of decisions families make, is that when you hear the kinds of decisions that families make, maybe they're making decisions they shouldn't have to make. So I remember a few years ago doing some focus groups with recipients of social security payments, and there were different kinds of populations we looked at, but a lot of them were obviously very poor families. And the kinds of decisions they had to make were, really, really troubling decisions about who got to eat, which child got to play sport on the weekend, whether we were going to have presents this year for Christmas, these kind of decisions. And I think something Jerry said yesterday I thought was quite profound and important. Jerry Redmond said yesterday it's quite profound and important we need to think about, which is the more inequality we have and the more poverty we have, the more work we're asking services to do, and the more energy we're asking poor families to spend on navigating ordinary daily life. And the less space they've got to do things that are more important and more valuable to them. And so maybe if they had spent less bandwidth on making those decisions, they could spend more bandwidth on making other decisions that would be higher value. And rather than policymakers wrestling with how we're going to get the families, manipulate the families to do something that we think would be good for them, if they had the space to do it, maybe they could do it themselves, and we could focus on some other things as well as policymakers, and the families could focus on some other things. So I think we need to think sometimes about whether we're forcing people to make decisions they shouldn't have to make.
Yeah, we can often forget those structural issues that are still about the distribution of resources and income in society. And we focus on the tailored and the localised or the co-designed, forgetting there are some big questions we still need governments to grapple with about what resources are used for who.
Karen, I wanted to ask you, overall, what is needed to ensure there's a level playing field and fair and equal access to programs, services and the things that families need in order to have a good quality of life?
Well, we could break down the door. That would be a good start. I mean, look, we go at these issues with not knowing instead of knowing. And I think that's been the kind of incredible lesson through COVID, which was, we were what were we? We were agile, and we were all these things.
Nimble.
My conference room turned into an IGA supermarket every Friday. I was shopping at Costco, and I can tell you exactly how many soup ladles it takes to get a kilo of flour. But the incredible, watching the incredible goodwill of community leaders come together, and I watched my incredibly diverse staff, where we're so often, there's, intersectionality. People think about, oh, you're queer or you're this or you're that. But when I had staff, walking and driving all around, feeding about 300 households, and the goodwill that created and generated, and trust in those communities. We learnt, that because our staff looked like them, because people were willing to deal with the immediate issue, that built the relationships where we could learn a hell of a lot more. And I realised that one of the things that I realised was that government departments had very little intel and knew anything about the rich infrastructure that exists in communities that they could have tapped into. I recalled, I think, listening to Jacinta Ardern on the night that, my family in New Zealand got kind of locked down, and it was like, we don't care whoever's in your bubble, just stay together tonight and we'll make sure you're all right. Whereas here, 600,000 New Zealanders, people who were, didn't have Australian citizens, we left them with no income. And it was just phenomenal, the fear that created. We were feeding sex workers all over Greater Melbourne who had kids. And, they were galvanising together and working out how to support. So if we look at some of the most incredible things that happened through COVID, and that incredible effort of some of our most marginalised people to look after their own, we could actually learn and change the way we think about building services and building trust with those communities.
Derek, I might just go to you.
Yeah, I love the idea of, let's start with not knowing and being comfortable with that, sitting with that.
It's worked for me for years.
Likewise. The not knowing is great, and I think the other idea that I would suggest we take away is this notion that let's learn to work with what's there. We say it in family support, and my colleague, Parenting Research Centre, have a whole model that starts with, coaching model that starts with celebrating what's there and what's happening that's working for you now. Now let's talk about, as a parent, what it is you might like some help with. So let's really embrace, in its many forms, what is there and what has helped in the last couple of years, what has helped with adversity. You can't hope to get rid of adversity. So what has helped with adversity? And let's learn from that wisdom. Like our New Zealand friends said, let's think about the ecology of well-being, and what wisdoms, what different kinds of expertise from those living their lives has helped with adversity. Other than that, I think we just stay with the notion that there are these resources, call them cultural resources or otherwise, that we have in those communities, in those families, and then there's others that we probably should get busy creating to help with decision points.
Okay, well, I'm just aware of the time. I know that the timekeepers are keeping us to, keeping us to time, and we can't go over past 10 o'clock. So I might just see if there are, throw it open for questions. Does anyone have any questions for our panellists? We've got a mic there, yes.
G'day, thank you. Look, I'm Michael. I'm a GP in Western Sydney. Karen's got it. Decisions are made in the context of relationships. What we need to think is the number of people in this room who actually are on the front line in relationships with people in distress are left with a version of the screwdriver and the hammer because healthcare, social care, primary care is not connected up. When your 5% come to me, I can do my best to create the relationship, but I need to have easy access to all the other relationships that are available in the community for this 5%, and I don't have that. Come on, policymakers.
I would just echo that. We, again, harping on about this idea of resources and cultures. Relationships have been mentioned many times over the last couple of days as a key asset that we haven't got enough of yet. I would just say ditto.
I suppose just to add, I think there are many attempts of government and community sector and others to try and address some of those issues, but they're trials, they're pilots, experiments that aren't often scaled up or sustained. And Australia's got an unfortunate history of doing a lot of really great work in social programs that they're often forgotten about or not scaled up to become more widespread. And I think, how do we create a movement? People are calling for where we have these really approaches that are evaluated and tested and seem to be effective. How do we roll them out? And we don't, but we have to caution they don't become a blanket approach. How do they become so they work in your community? They mightn't work in another community. How do we make that system work more effectively as a system that's coherent and effective for people?
Any other questions? Everyone's a bit quiet this morning. Oh, here we go.
Hi, Jennifer Webber with the Caroline Chisholm Society. And Karen, I'd like to come back to this point. You talk about the violence and with the trans community. And in the specialisation we work with mothers, and particularly on family violence, as you say, that history of violence that might be going on in other settings, the coercive control and practices. So what makes it particularly egregious in this family violence situation is that it's happening in the home, which should be safe, secure and nurturing. So when we go in to work with mothers in the home, it's almost like the onus of responsibility is on mum. If the violence happens outside the home, we would be addressing the issues of the perpetrator. When are we going to get to the point that we're going to say, this is egregious in the home, but when are we going to address the issue of getting the perpetrator out of the home to ensure safe, secure and nurturing environment, which is a right in itself to have that in your own home? Anyway, I think it's a very important issue that you touched on in terms of that violence part.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Karen, did you want to elaborate?
Yes, and look, and the other bit of, getting the perpetrator out of the home, what we set those women and those kids up for life, and the ongoing poverty, but it's okay because we're going to get them to grab a bit of their super fund and, so Oh, yeah. Yeah. But you'll be okay because there's an orange door you can go through. No, the orange door is a great thing. And they phone me, so. But it's just this idea of doors. It drives me crazy. So, yes, absolutely.
Any other questions for our panellists this one?
Victoria Tessa Inc., not-profit organisation that works with children and young people who exhibit challenging and violent behaviours. Researchers send out surveys. They gather the data. Tells us there's a major mental health issue for young people. Feeds up to government. Government comes out with a new approach. Big dollars. Where do the dollars go? To the big players, not the local groups. Thank you.
Can I just say something? We do an incredible amount of work around adolescents who use, what are they called? AIFS, adolescent who use violence in the home. And one of the enormous issues that I have in terms of the frames that we put around that is that I really fear we're going to take an adult perpetrator model and put that on young people. And I have all sorts of issues around that, developmentally and everything else. And we actually do have data. We have data that shows us that the vast majority of those young people, there is an adult male perpetrator of origin. But again, it's incredibly nuanced. You know, I think of the 80 families that we have worked with where a young person, and the degree of difference and diversity without that intersectional lens around seeing that actually some young people are parentified on one level because they're acting as translators for their mothers who have poor English skills, or where mum has escaped family violence and she parentifies the male child who's harming their siblings and taking on this role. So you're absolutely right. Again, nuance. Do not just take a model over here and place it on young people. We need to understand the context.
I think we have time for one more question.
I just wanted to finish more on a positive. Kathy Caritas is from Settlement Services International, based in New South Wales in child and family work. While Victoria may not have done well in some aspects with COVID, New South Wales, there were some really good examples of COVID government health leaning in some areas and working really well with cold leaders to get messages out around vaccinations and encouraging cold communities in southwest Sydney districts in particular, through churches, through communities and so forth. And on the back of that now, there is a large group of non-government organisations working with government agencies to say, how can we pick up and work with that and lean in together to look at sharing and shaping messages around keeping kids safe in families, in communities. It takes advocacy and it takes initiative, and it's doable. And I encourage everybody to think about what are your partnerships with cold communities and cold leaders, and do your little bit to engage. It's an uphill battle, and it's outside of our business as usual, but it is doable.
Yeah, and that's what I mean about looking into what happened. I guess my point about the public health response very early on, and New South Wales was just the same. And by the way, Victoria, still haven't forgiven you. Yeah, that's exactly right. But, you know, I think there was some incredible learnings that along the way around how we use that food delivery. And for instance, when the government they brought out multicultural language, vaccination kind of stuff and all that sort of stuff. And then they had queer kind of stuff over here. And I said, look, I actually need queer multicultural stuff. Can you help me with that? And that's the sort of stuff that all of a sudden people went, actually, it's the intersection of both those things. And if we're not nuanced, that gets missing. You know, and for a lot of our trans folk, not having the right documentation was the biggest impediment of them walking in to get a vaccination shot or being misgendered.
Sorry, the e-safety
Yep.
presentation yesterday we were talking about, there was one slide there yesterday where it had families coming into the diversity of families, cultural families, new arrivals, rainbow families, blended families, intergeneration families. There's opportunities to pick up on those, those messages and show.
Yeah, use what you've got. Learn from what we know is there in that wisdom. And I guess the last 2 years have shone a light on what we've got in adversity. And again, on a positive note, there was this quote I heard on a reality show on TV, which was, failing can be fatal, but failure to change it can be worse.
Well, I think we're getting the wind-up music here. It is a huge area of discussion, and I think we could be talking about this for another few hours, but unfortunately we have to wrap it up now. So won't you please thank our panellists, Karen Steele, Derek McCormack,